Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. The Library Encounter. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint aroma of fallen leaves and roasted chestnuts through the old campus. The library's Gothic spires pierced the evening sky, bathed in hues of amber and crimson from the setting sun. Inside, it was another world, a sanctuary of knowledge and solitude. The faint hum of whispers, the occasional scrape of a chair, and the soft rustle of pages turning filled the vast, dimly lit hall. Evelyn Harper sat at her usual spot, a secluded corner by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the courtyard. Her chestnut hair spilled over her shoulders, catching the light of the antique brass lamp on her desk. She had been immersed in her book for hours, lost in the intricate plot of a 19th-century romance novel. The irony wasn't lost on her, reading about grand gestures of love while her own life remained untouched by such passions. That evening, as she flipped to the next page, she felt a presence. Not a sound, not a word, but an unmistakable awareness of being observed. She glanced up, her hazel eyes meeting those of a stranger seated at the opposite table. He looked away instantly, pretending to jot something in a leather-bound notebook. He was new. Evelyn would have remembered him. She had spent enough time here to know most of the regulars. His dark hair fell messily across his forehead, and his sharp features hinted at a mixture of arrogance and intrigue. Something about him was magnetic, though Evelyn couldn't quite place why. The minutes ticked by, and Evelyn found herself stealing glances at the stranger. Every time she looked, she caught him looking back, as if caught in a game neither had agreed to play. Finally, her curiosity got the better of her. She closed her book with a soft thud, stood up, and made her way to the bookshelf near his table. Not too close, but close enough to invite conversation. "Hard to find a seat here on Fridays," she remarked casually, scanning the spines of books she wasn't really interested in. He looked up, startled, then smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile that revealed a dimple on his left cheek. "Guess I got lucky," he replied, his voice deep but warm. "Or maybe fate had something to do with it." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Fate? That's quite a stretch for a library seat." "Maybe," he said, leaning back in his chair, "but don't you think some of the best stories begin with chance meetings?" She laughed softly. "A storyteller, I see." "And you, a skeptic?" he countered. Evelyn tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. "A realist." "Realists can dream too," he said, closing his notebook and standing. He extended a hand. "I'm Liam." She hesitated for a moment, then shook it. His grip was firm, his hand warm against hers. "Evelyn." They spent the next hour talking, their conversation flowing effortlessly. She learned that he was a transfer student from London, studying literature with a passion for writing. He told her about his love for obscure poetry, and she found herself laughing at his dry humor. She shared her own dreams of becoming a historian, of uncovering stories buried in time. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt seen, her guarded walls cracking ever so slightly. As the library clock struck 9, Evelyn glanced at her watch. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "Me too," Liam replied. "But can I see you again? Same time tomorrow?" Her heart fluttered. "Maybe," she teased, walking away with a smile. The next evening, Evelyn arrived at the library early. She had replayed their conversation in her mind all day, feeling a strange anticipation she hadn't experienced in years. But as the hours passed, Liam didn't show. Disappointment weighed heavily, though she tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he had a good reason. Days turned into weeks, and Liam became a ghost of memory, lingering but fading. Evelyn returned to her books, her studies, trying to convince herself that their encounter had been fleeting, insignificant. Months later, as winter enveloped the campus, Evelyn stumbled upon a flyer in the student lounge. It was an announcement for a campus literary magazine. The featured story was titled "The Library Girl" by Liam Everett. Her heart raced as she flipped through the pages, finding the story near the end. It was their meeting, written with haunting detail. The nervous glances, the shared words, even her laughter. But as the story continued, it diverged into fiction. In Liam's narrative, the girl had vanished, leaving behind only a book with her name scrawled inside the cover. Evelyn's breath caught as she read the last lines. "Sometimes the best stories are the ones we can't finish." and sometimes they're the ones that never truly began. She flipped to the contributors page, searching for Liam's name. Beneath it was a single line. In loving memory of Liam Everett, 1998, Evelyn froze, the magazine trembling in her hands. A chill ran down her spine as realization dawned. Liam had died weeks before their meeting, and yet she could still feel the warmth of his hand, the sound of his laughter echoing in her mind. What do you think? Chapter 2. The Unfinished Thread. Winter deepened its hold on the city, draping the campus in a blanket of snow. The once vibrant library courtyard was now silent, save for the crunch of boots on icy paths and the occasional breath of wind. Evelyn sat at her usual spot, the same corner where she had met him. The magazine lay on the table, its pages worn from her countless rereadings. She couldn't stop thinking about it, about Liam, the story, and the impossible truth. How could someone who no longer existed have been so vividly real? She remembered his voice, the dimple in his cheek, the way he had made her laugh. It was all too tangible to dismiss as coincidence or a trick of her mind. Evelyn turned to the story again, her fingers tracing the words as if they held some hidden clue. Every sentence felt deliberate, as though Liam had been speaking directly to her. But what stood out most were the details that weren't in the story, the things he hadn't known about her, like her love for historical archives or her favorite tea. If he were a figment of her imagination, surely he couldn't have known those things. The nagging questions consumed her. Who was Liam Everett? And why had he written about her? If he had written about her at all. That afternoon, Evelyn decided she needed answers. She went to the English department, where a secretary pointed her toward a shelf of bound student works. Liam's name appeared on several: essays, poems, and short stories. She pulled them down, one by one, and sat in a quiet corner to read. His writing was raw and poetic, filled with vivid imagery and a recurring theme of fleeting connections. In one essay, he described the fragile beauty of moments that slip through our fingers, never to be held again. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. The words resonated with an ache she couldn't name. Among the works, she found a photograph tucked into the pages of a leather-bound anthology. It was Liam, younger but unmistakable, sitting on a stone bench with a book in hand. His smile was faint, almost hesitant, as if he were unused to the camera. On the back, someone had scrawled, "To Liam, who never stops chasing stories." Evelyn's resolve hardened. She needed to know more. Her search led her to the campus archives, a dimly lit maze of shelves that smelled of old paper and dust. She found a file on Liam, class records, awards, and a program from his memorial service. He had been a prodigy, well loved by professors and peers. But his life had ended abruptly. The details were sparse, but a newspaper clipping filled in the blanks. Liam had died in a car accident late one autumn night, just a week before she'd first seen him in the library. Her heart pounded as she pieced it together. The dates didn't align. If Liam had died before their meeting, then who or what had she spoken to? Evelyn's nights became restless, her dreams vivid and strange. She often found herself back in the library, the amber glow of the lamps casting long shadows. In these dreams, she would turn a corner and see him, always just out of reach. He never spoke, but his eyes seemed to ask her something, a silent plea she couldn't understand. One evening, as snow fell in heavy flakes outside, Evelyn returned to the library, drawn by an inexplicable pull. The place was nearly empty, the usual bustle replaced by an eerie stillness. She made her way to their corner, her breath visible in the cold air. And then she saw it. On the table where they had first spoken, someone had left a notebook. It was leather-bound, identical to the one Liam had been writing in that night. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The pages were filled with his handwriting, every line written with care. But these weren't stories. They were letters. To her. Evelyn, if you're reading this, then you've found the thread I left behind. I don't know how or why we met, but I know it was real. You were real. You made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years, even if only for a moment. I've always believed that stories have the power to transcend time, to connect souls across impossible distances. Maybe that's what we are. Two stories that crossed when they weren't supposed to. I wish I could stay. But the story always ends, doesn't it? Still, I hope you'll carry a piece of me with you, the way I'll carry you with me, wherever I go. Yours, Liam. Evelyn sat there for hours, the words sinking into her like the weight of an anchor. She didn't know how it was possible, whether it was some glitch in reality, a trick of the universe, or something far beyond her understanding. All she knew was that it mattered. When she finally stood to leave, she felt a strange sense of peace, as though the world had shifted in some imperceptible way. She tucked the notebook into her bag and stepped out into the snow, the cold biting her cheeks. As she walked, she noticed footprints beside hers in the untouched snow. 2 sets, side by side. She stopped, turning to look behind her, but no one was there. The footprints faded before her eyes, as if they had never existed. And yet, she couldn't help but smile. The story wasn't over. Chapter 3. Echoes of the Unseen. Winter began to loosen its grip as February bled into March. The days grew longer, and the pale sun hung in the sky a little more boldly. Yet for Evelyn, time felt stagnant. Liam's notebook had become her constant companion, its pages worn from her restless fingers tracing the looping handwriting. She read and reread his words until she could recite them from memory, but no matter how many times she turned the pages, new questions surfaced. Was Liam's letter a final goodbye, or an invitation to uncover something more? Evelyn's life had become a paradox. By day, she attended classes and exchanged pleasantries with classmates, trying to maintain an air of normalcy. By night, she wandered the campus with Liam's notebook tucked under her arm, searching for traces of him, anything to suggest their encounter had been more than a fleeting impossibility. It was on one of these solitary walks, with a cold wind tugging at her scarf, that she found herself drawn back to the library. This time not to her usual corner, but to the archive room in the basement. The archive room was a place few visited. Dusty, dimly lit, and filled with rows of metal filing cabinets, it was where the university stored records too old or obscure to digitize. Evelyn had no clear reason to be there, only a strange certainty that the next piece of the puzzle lay within these walls. She ran her fingers along the filing cabinet labels, student records, faculty memos, library acquisitions. Then she stopped at a drawer marked simply, uncatalogued. She hesitated, a sense of anticipation prickling at the back of her neck. Inside were papers in disarray, yellowed manuscripts, forgotten essays, and folders with names that meant nothing to her. She sifted through them with growing frustration until her hand brushed against something peculiar, a small, leather-bound book. It was smaller than Liam's notebook, but eerily similar in design. She opened it and gasped. The first page bore a title written in familiar handwriting, The Library Girl. Beneath it was a note scrawled in the margin. The story is incomplete. She'll know how to finish it. Evelyn's heart raced as she flipped through the pages. The story was the same one published in the campus magazine, but this version contained additional scenes, moments she didn't recognize. There were passages where Liam described wandering through the library after hours, as if searching for someone or something. In one entry, he wrote about feeling pulled toward an unseen presence, as though the building itself were alive. The final pages were blank. As Evelyn sat alone in the archive room, the silence pressed against her ears. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't entirely alone. The room felt charged, as if the very air were waiting for something. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered aloud, her voice trembling. No answer came, but the light above her flickered once, then twice, before steadying. Her eyes drifted to the notebook in her lap. The words, "she'll know how to finish it," burned in her mind. Did Liam mean for her to write the ending? Or was the message something else entirely? That night, Evelyn dreamed again. She was in the library, but it wasn't the warm, familiar place she knew. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and the air crackled with an otherworldly energy. She wandered through endless rows of shelves, calling Liam's name. At last she saw him. He stood at the far end of the room, his back to her, bathed in golden light. "Liam," she cried, her voice echoing. He turned, his face as familiar as her own reflection, but his expression was somber. "Evelyn," he said, his voice distant as though carried by the wind. "Why are you here?" "I don't know," she admitted. I can't let this go. I need to understand." Liam stepped closer, but the light around him dimmed with each step. his figure growing fainter. "Not everything needs understanding," he said gently. "Some stories are meant to be felt, not solved." "But you wrote to me. You left this for me to find," she protested. "I did," he said, his voice softening, "because I wanted you to know I was real, that we were real. But my story ended long before yours began." Tears blurred Evelyn's vision. "Then why do I still feel like you're here? Like you're waiting for something?" Liam smiled, bittersweet. "Because I am. But it's not up to me anymore. You hold the pen now." Evelyn woke with a start, her cheeks damp with tears. The notebook lay on her nightstand, its leather cover glinting in the pale dawn light. Her fingers brushed against it, but she hesitated to open it again. Instead, she pulled out her own journal, a simple, unassuming book she hadn't touched in months. She flipped to a blank page and began to write. She wrote about Liam, about their fleeting connection and the questions he had left behind. But she also wrote about herself, her fears, her dreams, and the way her life had shifted since that night in the library. The words flowed effortlessly, as if guided by some unseen hand. When she finished, she closed the journal and sat back, a strange sense of calm washing over her. She didn't have all the answers, but she no longer felt the need to search for them. Somewhere in the quiet of her room, she thought she heard a faint whisper, like the turning of a page. And then, silence. Evelyn never saw Liam again, not in the library, not in her dreams. But she carried him with her, his presence woven into the fabric of her story. Years later, as she published her first book, The Unfinished Thread, she dedicated it simply, "For Liam, who taught me that some endings are beginnings in disguise." Chapter 4. The Whisper of Forever. Spring came hesitantly, brushing the campus with soft greens and delicate blossoms. Evelyn's world had changed, yet not in ways that others could see. On the surface, she was still the diligent student, the quiet girl in the library corner. But within her, the threads of Liam's story wove a tapestry of longing, understanding, and, most unexpectedly, courage. She had written and rewritten her feelings in her journal, trying to make sense of the impossible. The words Liam had left her, and the ones he hadn't, became the foundation of something larger. It wasn't just about Liam anymore. It was about herself, about the life she wanted to live, and the stories she wanted to tell. But the questions never truly faded. There were nights she still woke, heart-pounding, feeling as though he were close, just out of reach. She tried to let go, to focus on the present, but some part of her couldn't help but wonder, was there more? One late evening, weeks before finals, Evelyn found herself back in the library. The air was warm, the last hints of sunset streaming through the windows. She wandered aimlessly, her feet carrying her past shelves she had walked countless times. Her eyes fell on a familiar section, local history. She paused, running her fingers over the spines of dusty, forgotten books. It was a section she rarely visited, but something compelled her now. She pulled out a slim volume with a cracked leather cover and opened it to the first page. There, tucked between two brittle sheets of parchment, was a folded piece of paper. Her breath caught as she unfolded it, her fingers trembling. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Evelyn," it began. "If you're reading this, it means you haven't given up. I hoped you wouldn't. There's something I need you to see, something I couldn't show you before. Go to the west wing, 3rd floor, the door at the end of the hall." Evelyn clutched the note to her chest, her pulse racing. She didn't question how the letter had come to be here, or why it had waited for her. All she knew was that she had to follow its instructions. The west wing of the library was rarely used, reserved for special collections and locked archives. As Evelyn climbed the spiral staircase to the 3rd floor, her footsteps echoed in the stillness. At the end of the hallway was a heavy wooden door, its surface carved with intricate patterns. She hesitated. The note felt heavier in her pocket, its meaning pressing against her thoughts. What would she find on the other side? Another piece of him, or another question she couldn't answer? Gathering her courage, she pushed the door open. The room was unlike anything she had seen in the library before. It was vast and circular, its walls lined with ancient books bound in leather and gold. A domed ceiling arched high above, painted with a mural of stars and constellations. In the center stood a single desk, and on it lay a small, glowing object. Evelyn approached cautiously. The object was a sphere of pale light, no larger than her palm, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. As she reached out, the glow intensified, filling the room with warmth. The moment her fingers touched it, the world shifted. She was no longer in the library. Instead, she stood in a vast expanse of light and shadow, a place that felt infinite yet intimate. The air hummed with energy, and before her, a figure materialized. Liam. He looked the same as he had that first night, his dark hair slightly tousled, his expression a mix of joy and sadness. "Evelyn," he said, his voice echoing like a melody. Tears welled in her eyes. "Liam, how is this possible?" He smiled gently. "This isn't the end, Evelyn. It never was. You've been searching for answers, but some things can't be explained. They can only be experienced." She stepped closer, her heart aching with the weight of all she wanted to say. "Why did you leave me those notes? Why bring me here?" "Because I needed you to see," he said, gesturing to the space around them. "Stories don't end. Not really. They ripple, intertwine, and continue in ways we can't imagine. You and I, we're part of something bigger. You felt it, haven't you? That pull, that connection?" She nodded, unable to speak. Liam's gaze softened. "You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. A chance to matter, to be remembered. And now it's time for you to live your story, to write it, to share it. Don't let this become a weight you carry. Let it be a gift." Evelyn's voice trembled. "Will I ever see you again?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, placing a hand over hers. His touch was warm, solid, real. "In every word you write, in every story you tell, I'll be there," he said softly. "And maybe one day, when the time is right, our stories will cross again." The light around them grew brighter, enveloping him in its glow. "Goodbye, Evelyn," he whispered, his voice fading like a distant echo. And then he was gone. Evelyn woke in the library, her head resting on the desk. The room was empty, the glowing sphere nowhere to be seen. For a moment she wondered if it had all been a dream. But when she reached into her pocket, her fingers closed around the folded note. She smiled through her tears. Liam had been right. Stories didn't end, and hers was just beginning. Final chapter, the story that remains. Years passed, as they always do. The seasons wove their cycles, and Evelyn's life moved forward, steady and unrelenting. But Liam and the moments they shared never truly left her. Instead, they became a part of her, threaded into the choices she made, the words she wrote, and the person she became. She finished her studies and embarked on a career as an author, her first book, The Unfinished Thread, catapulting her into literary acclaim. Critics praised its haunting prose and its exploration of time, memory, and connection. Readers wrote to her, sharing how the story had changed them, how it made them believe in the unseen and the power of stories to connect even the most distant lives. But Evelyn knew the truth. The book was more than a story, it was a promise fulfilled. One spring afternoon, Evelyn found herself at a small bookstore in a quiet seaside town. She was there for a signing. Her latest novel, a collection of short stories, having just been released. The shop was quaint and cozy, its walls lined with mismatched shelves and faded paperbacks. The signing had ended hours ago, but Evelyn lingered, enjoying the quiet after the bustle. She wandered through the aisles, her fingers brushing the spines of books, her mind lost in thought. That's when she saw it. Tucked on a high shelf, almost hidden, was a familiar leather-bound notebook. It wasn't hers, or at least it shouldn't have been. Her breath caught as she pulled it down, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The notebook was identical to Liam's, down to the faint scuff marks on its cover. She opened it, her hands trembling, and found a single page filled with writing. "Evelyn," it read. "It's been a while, hasn't it? I've been watching, in the way that I can, and I'm proud of you. You've carried our story further than I ever could have imagined. But this isn't the end. It's never the end. There's something waiting for you, something you'll only find if you're willing to look. Go to the lighthouse at the edge of the harbor. I'll meet you there." Evelyn's heart thundered in her chest. The words felt impossible, yet undeniable. She didn't pause to question their authenticity. She only knew she had to go. The lighthouse stood at the edge of the world, its white tower rising against the backdrop of a setting sun. Waves crashed against the rocks below, their rhythmic roar filling the air. Evelyn climbed the winding path, her steps quickened by a sense of urgency she couldn't explain. When she reached the top, the golden light bathed everything in a surreal glow. The small circular room was empty except for a wooden chair and a table. On the table lay another notebook, open to its first page. Evelyn stepped closer, her breath catching as she read, "The story we write now is ours." She turned, and there he was. Liam stood by the window, his silhouette outlined by the sun sinking into the horizon. He looked just as he had in her dreams, real and solid, yet with an ethereal quality, as though he existed in a space between worlds. "You're here," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I am," he said, smiling softly, "and so are you." She crossed the room, closing the distance between them, afraid that he might disappear if she moved too quickly. But he didn't fade. He stayed, his presence steady and warm. "How is this possible?" she asked, her voice trembling. Liam reached for her hand, his touch as real as the wind that ruffled her hair. "Because some stories aren't meant to end. Some connections are stronger than time, stronger than life itself. We found each other once, Evelyn, and we'll find each other again as many times as it takes." She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The ache she had carried for so long, the questions, the longing, all of it melted away. They stood together, watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of gold and crimson. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt complete, as though every piece of her life had finally fallen into place. Liam turned to her, his eyes filled with a quiet joy. "This isn't the end, Evelyn. It's the beginning of something we'll write together." And in that moment, as the light faded and the stars began to appear, she believed him. Epilogue. The next morning, when Evelyn returned to the lighthouse, it was empty. The notebook was gone, the table bare. But she didn't feel sorrow. Instead, she felt a deep, unshakable peace. She carried the memory of that evening with her, not as a mystery to solve, but as a promise fulfilled. Liam had taught her that stories live on, not in their endings, but in the echoes they leave behind. Years later, when Evelyn's final book was published, it was dedicated to a figure most readers would never understand. For Liam, my beginning, my middle, and my forever. And somewhere, beyond the reach of time, she knew he was smiling. Chapter 1. The Train to Nowhere. The rhythmic clatter of train wheels against steel tracks echoed through the stillness of the late autumn night. Elena adjusted her scarf against the biting chill seeping through the cracks of the train car. She had chosen this journey on a whim, as she often did since leaving her small hometown. The destination didn't matter. The thrill of movement, the escape from her stagnant life, was what she sought. Across from her, a young man in a worn leather jacket scribbled in a notebook. His brows furrowed in concentration, and his lips moved slightly as if he were mouthing silent words. Elena watched him, fascinated. There was something captivating about his intensity, as though he carried the weight of untold stories in his head. She glanced away when he looked up, her heart skipping a beat. "Writing's a lonely pursuit," he said, his voice deep but soft, like the distant hum of the train's engine. Elena blinked, caught off guard by his sudden address. "Is it?" she replied, unsure if she was supposed to agree or challenge him. He nodded, a faint smile curving his lips. "It's like shouting into a void, hoping someone shouts back. I suppose we all do that in one way or another." Elena tilted her head, intrigued. "And what are you shouting about?" The man closed his notebook, tapping it lightly. "Nothing special, just trying to make sense of things." His answer was vague, yet it felt meaningful. They fell into conversation easily, as though they were old friends. He introduced himself as Liam, a freelance writer traveling to collect stories. His questions to her were pointed yet warm, drawing out pieces of her life she rarely shared with strangers. She told him about the small village where she grew up, nestled between rolling hills and whispering forests, about her restless desire to see the world, to experience something beyond the predictable rhythm of her childhood, and about the emptiness she sometimes felt, as though she were a wandering ghost in search of a purpose. Liam listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're not a ghost," he said finally. "You're more like a comet, blazing across the sky, leaving a trail of wonder." The compliment, unexpected and poetic, made Elena blush. "And what are you, then?" he chuckled, leaning back against the worn seat. A bystander hoping to catch a glimpse before the comet disappears. Their connection deepened as the hours passed, the train speeding through the darkness. They talked about dreams and regrets, the weight of memories, and the fear of what lay ahead. For the first time in a long while, Elena felt truly seen. The train began to slow as dawn broke, its golden light filtering through the windows. "This is my stop," Liam said, standing and slinging a battered backpack over his shoulder. Elena's heart sank. She didn't want this night to end. "Where are you going?" "Nowhere in particular," he replied with a wistful smile. "But maybe someday we'll cross paths again." Before she could say more, he was gone, disappearing into the bustling platform. She pressed her hand against the cool glass, watching him merge with the crowd. The train lurched forward, carrying her away from him. Elena sighed, her thoughts lingering on Liam as the journey continued. But as the morning wore on, a strange unease settled over her. She reached for the small bag she had kept beside her, and froze. It was gone. Panic surged through her as she frantically searched the compartment. Her wallet, her passport, her few precious belongings. They had all been in that bag. Her chest tightened as realization dawned. Liam. His warm smile, his poetic words, his intense gaze, they had all been a carefully crafted act. She had been nothing more than a mark, another story for his collection. The train sped on, the rhythmic clatter now a mocking chorus. Elena sank into her seat, the sting of betrayal sharp against the memory of fleeting connection. But even amidst her despair, a part of her couldn't help but admire the artistry of his deceit. After all, he had made her believe in magic, even if only for a single night. Chapter 2: A Trail of Ashes. Elena sat motionless, her hand still resting on the seat where her bag had been. The train car felt colder now, the warmth of Liam's presence replaced by the icy sting of betrayal. Her mind raced, replaying their conversations, dissecting every word he had said. How had she been so blind, so easily fooled? She clenched her fists, anger bubbling to the surface. This wasn't just a random act of theft. It was personal. Liam had looked her in the eyes, listened to her story, and still chosen to steal from her. For someone who claimed to be searching for meaning, he seemed to have none. The train pulled into the next station, and Elena made a decision. She wasn't going to let this end here. She stepped off the train, her boots hitting the platform with purpose. If Liam thought he could disappear into the crowd like a ghost, he had underestimated her. The station was chaotic, a cacophony of voices, footsteps, and announcements echoing through the air. Elena scanned the sea of faces, searching for the familiar leather jacket and dark eyes. She spotted a ticket booth and hurried over, her heart pounding. "Excuse me," she said breathlessly. "The man who got off at the last stop, tall, leather jacket, dark hair. Did you see which way he went?" The attendant raised an eyebrow. "We get a lot of people like that." "He had a notebook," she added. "He might have been scribbling in it." The attendant frowned, considering. "I think I saw him heading toward the west exit. Might have caught a bus." Elena muttered her thanks and took off toward the exit. Outside, the chill of early morning bit at her cheeks. A line of buses idled by the curb, their engines humming. She approached the nearest driver. "Did you see a man with a leather jacket and a notebook? He would have gotten on in the past 15 minutes. The driver shook his head, but the second one nodded. "Yeah, he boarded about 5 minutes ago. Took the one to Rivertown." Rivertown. Elena didn't know the place, but it didn't matter. She'd find him. She bought a ticket for the next bus and settled into her seat, her determination hardening with each passing mile. Rivertown was a sleepy village nestled in a valley, its cobblestone streets and ivy-covered buildings straight out of a postcard. But Elena wasn't here to admire the scenery. She asked around, showing the handful of people on the street a vague description of Liam. Most shook their heads, but one shopkeeper pointed her toward a small cafe on the edge of town. She found him there, sitting at a corner table with his notebook open. His bag, her bag, sat on the floor beside him. He didn't notice her at first, too engrossed in his writing. She approached quietly, her anger simmering just below the surface. "Liam," she said, her voice steady. He looked up, startled. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe even guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Elena," he said, leaning back in his chair as if they were old friends. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "Give it back," she demanded, pointing at the bag. Liam sighed, closing his notebook. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this." "Find out what? That you're a liar? A thief?" Her voice rose, drawing a few curious glances from other patrons. He raised his hands in mock surrender. "It's not what you think." "Really?" she snapped. "Because it seems pretty clear to me. You charmed me, stole my things, and disappeared." Liam hesitated, then reached for the bag. He slid it across the table toward her. "Take it." Elena grabbed it, opening it to check the contents. Everything was there, untouched. Confusion mingled with her anger. Why steal it if you weren't going to keep it? Liam's expression softened, and for the first time he looked vulnerable. "I wasn't stealing it. I was borrowing it." "Borrowing?" she repeated, incredulous. "That's your excuse?" "I needed something of yours," he said quietly. "Something meaningful, and I couldn't just ask." "Why not?" "Because," he said, leaning forward, "you wouldn't have believed me." "Believed what?" "That I'm not who you think I am." Elena stared at him, her frustration growing. Enough with the cryptic nonsense. "Who are you, then?" Liam hesitated, as if weighing whether to tell her. Finally, he sighed. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Elena crossed her arms. "Try me." He glanced around, ensuring no one was listening. Then he leaned in closer and said, barely above a whisper, "I'm not from here." She frowned. "Not from here? You mean Rivertown?" "No," he said, his voice steady. "I mean this world." The air seemed to still. Elena blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "What?" "I don't belong here," Liam said. "I came here by mistake, and I need that bag because it has something of yours that can help me get back." Elena's first instinct was to laugh, but the intensity in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't joking. He believed every word he was saying. "Do you have any idea how crazy that sounds?" she said finally. "Of course I do," he said, a rueful smile playing at his lips. "But it's the truth, and if you'll let me, I can prove it." Elena hesitated, torn between the urge to walk away and the strange pull to stay. Something in Liam's gaze and the way he spoke made her pause. "What's in it for me?" she asked cautiously. "Answers," he said simply, "to questions you didn't even know you had." Against her better judgment, she sat down. "Start talking." Chapter 3. Through the cracks. Elena leaned back in her chair, gripping her coffee mug tightly. The warmth of the cup contrasted with the cold disbelief pooling in her chest. Liam's calm, unwavering demeanor unnerved her. "All right," she said, forcing a steady tone. "You've got my attention. Explain yourself." Liam exhaled slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of his notebook. "I come from a place you wouldn't recognize, a world parallel to yours but vastly different. It's connected to this one through threads, invisible cracks in the fabric of reality." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Threads and cracks? Are you seriously expecting me to buy this?" He looked at her, his gaze piercing. "You've felt it, haven't you? That pull when you wander alone, like the world is bigger than it seems, like there's more just out of reach." She stiffened. His words struck too close to the truth. Since childhood, she had felt like an outsider, as though her place in the world was precarious, temporary. But she wasn't about to admit that to him. "I feel like you've read too many fantasy novels," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. Liam didn't flinch. "I thought the same when I first crossed over, but I've seen too much to dismiss it as fiction." "Crossed over?" Elena pressed, despite herself. "Yes," he said. "By accident. I was experimenting with pathways, trying to understand the connections between our worlds. One misstep, and I ended up here. And here, the rules are different. I've been stuck ever since." She leaned forward, her skepticism slowly giving way to curiosity. "If you're stuck, why do you need my bag? What's so special about it?" "It's not the bag itself," he explained. "It's what you carry. Something uniquely yours, your story, your essence. I've been searching for someone like you, someone who has the kind of energy I need to reopen the pathway. Your memories, your emotions, they're a key." Elena's eyes narrowed. "You mean to tell me you stole my bag because you think I'm some kind of portal battery?" "Not a battery," he said quickly. "More like a beacon. Your connection to this world is tenuous, like mine. That makes you special, and it means you can help me get home." Her mind reeled. Every logical part of her screamed that this was ridiculous, but his sincerity unsettled her. He wasn't joking, wasn't mocking her. He truly believed what he was saying. "And what happens to me if you use me as this beacon?" she asked cautiously. Liam hesitated, and in that moment she saw something flicker in his expression. Hesitation, maybe even guilt. "It's hard to explain. You might feel disoriented, but it won't harm you. I promise," she laughed bitterly. "Oh, great. Just a little reality distortion, no big deal." "I wouldn't ask if there was another way," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I've been trying for years, Alina. Years of wandering, searching, failing. I'm running out of time." Her heart wavered. Despite everything, she sensed his desperation was real, and beneath it, a strange sense of kinship stirred in her chest. She had spent so much of her life feeling adrift, disconnected from her own world. What if there was a reason? What if he wasn't entirely wrong? "Let's say I believe you," she said slowly. "Why should I help you? What's in it for me?" Liam leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "If I can reopen the pathway, I might be able to help you find the answers you've been looking for. Why you've always felt out of place. Why you're drawn to the unknown. Maybe even what you're meant to do." His words sank into her like hooks, tugging at something deep and unspoken. For years she had been running, searching for meaning. What if this was it? What if Liam's strange, impossible story was the answer? But the rational part of her held firm. "Or maybe you're just a con artist with a good story." Liam smiled faintly. "If you really believed that, you wouldn't still be sitting here." She hated that he was right. Every instinct told her to walk away, but she couldn't. Her curiosity burned too brightly. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His smile faded, replaced by a seriousness that sent a shiver down her spine. "We need to go to one of the cracks." "Where?" she asked. "There's a place nearby," he said. "A place where the veil between worlds is thin. You'll know it when you see it." She crossed her arms. "And what happens when we get there?" "I'll guide you through it," Liam said. "The rest depends on you." "Depends on me." Her stomach twisted. "What does that even mean?" "You'll have to trust me," he said simply. Trust. The word lingered in the air between them, heavy and loaded. Trusting him was the last thing she wanted to do, but some part of her, a reckless, hopeful part, refused to walk away. "Fine," she said finally. "But if this goes sideways, I'm turning you into the police." Liam chuckled, the first lightness she'd seen in him since their reunion. Fair enough. They set out before sunset, the town's quaint charm fading into the wilderness as they walked. Liam led the way, his steps confident, as though he had been here before. Elena followed, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. They reached the edge of a dense forest as twilight descended, the shadows stretching long and eerie. Liam stopped, turning to face her. "This is it," he said. Elena looked around, frowning. "It's just a forest." "Not quite," Liam murmured. He held out his hand. "Take my hand." She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stop, but something about the intensity in his gaze pushed her forward. She placed her hand in his, and he squeezed it gently. "Close your eyes," he said. Reluctantly, she obeyed. The air around them seemed to change, growing heavier, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. A strange hum vibrated through her, as though the earth itself was trembling. "Keep walking," Liam whispered. Elena felt him guide her forward, each step tingling with anticipation. The hum grew louder, more insistent, until it was a roar in her ears. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. When she opened her eyes, the world had changed. The forest was gone, replaced by a shimmering expanse of light and shadow, a landscape that seemed to ripple and twist like liquid glass. Elena gasped, her knees weak. "What is this?" she whispered. "This," Liam said, his voice filled with awe, "is the space between worlds." Before she could respond, the ground beneath her feet shifted, and the air cracked like a thunderclap. She stumbled, clutching Liam's arm. "What's happening?" She cried. But he didn't answer. His expression had changed, no longer calm, but panicked. The shimmering light around them began to pulse violently, and Elena realized too late that something had gone terribly wrong. Chapter 4. The Fracture. The world around them began to pulse and vibrate, the edges of reality warping as if it were being stretched like a taut fabric. Elena's heart raced, the dizziness of the shifting landscape making her stumble. Liam gripped her arm tightly, but his face was twisted in fear, his usual calm completely shattered. "What's happening?" she gasped, her voice barely audible over the rising hum that filled the air. "We're losing it," Liam shouted, his eyes wide. "The crack is destabilizing. I've never seen it do this before." Elena's mind spun, trying to make sense of what was happening. The space between worlds, the cracks in reality, none of it made sense, and yet here she was, caught in the heart of it. The shimmering landscape shifted like liquid glass, bending and folding in unnatural ways, and the ground beneath them seemed to be splintering, cracks racing across the surface like lightning. "We need to leave. Now." Liam pulled at her arm, his panic palpable. I wasn't supposed to bring you here. Not like this." Before she could respond, the air crackled violently, and a burst of white light exploded around them, blinding her. She instinctively squeezed her eyes shut, but the force of the explosion knocked her to the ground. When she opened her eyes again, everything had changed. The crack, the rift between worlds, was gone. Instead of the surreal, shifting expanse, they were standing in an empty, desolate landscape. The ground was cracked and dry, the sky above a dark, oppressive gray. There were no trees, no signs of life, just the barren expanse stretching out for miles. The only thing that remained unchanged was the faint hum that echoed through the air, vibrating in her chest. "What is this place?" Elena whispered, her voice shaking. Liam didn't answer right away. He stood there, frozen, staring at the horizon as if he were seeing something beyond it. His expression was hollow, the usual fire in his eyes replaced by a deep, resigned sorrow. "This is the place I was trying to avoid," he said softly, his voice distant. "It's where the cracks lead when they break, a place between places, a limbo of sorts. But it's not supposed to be this way. We shouldn't be here." Elena's stomach twisted with unease. "And what do we do now?" Liam's face hardened as he looked at her, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Now we figure out how to survive." Before she could ask what he meant, a distant noise echoed across the barren landscape, a low, rumbling sound, like thunder, but it wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from the ground. Liam's eyes snapped to the horizon, his expression darkening. "We don't have much time." Elena felt her heart skip a beat. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and then, from the distance, she saw something. Shifting shapes, moving toward them. At first it was hard to tell what they were, but as they got closer, the shapes became clearer. Figures, humanoid in form, but twisted and distorted. Their skin seemed to ripple, as if it weren't quite solid, and their eyes, if you could call them eyes, glowed with a sickly, unnatural light. Liam didn't wait for Elena to react. He grabbed her hand and yanked her into motion. "Run!" They sprinted across the cracked earth, the figures behind them growing closer, their eerie wails cutting through the silence. Elena's breath caught in her throat, her legs burning as they pushed forward, the ground beneath them shifting like quicksand. "What are they?" she gasped, barely able to keep up with Liam. "Hunters," Liam spat. "They're what happens when the cracks open too wide. They feed on the instability, on the energy that slips through the rift, and right now they're drawn to us." She didn't need to ask any more questions. She could feel the pulse of something dark, something ancient, pushing against her, pulling at her thoughts. Whatever these creatures were, they were not of this world, and they were hungry. The landscape around them was shifting again, the horizon bending in unnatural angles, but there was no way to stop. They had to keep running. Suddenly, Liam stumbled and Elena's heart lurched. She turned just in time to see him fall to the ground, a sharp gasp of pain escaping his lips. "No!" she cried, rushing back toward him. But before she could reach him, one of the hunters lunged, its elongated limbs reaching out with terrifying speed. It grabbed Liam by the arm, dragging him backward with an unnatural force. Elena screamed, her instincts screaming at her to help, to do something. But as she rushed toward him, the air around her thickened, and the ground beneath her feet cracked open like a yawning chasm. She tumbled, unable to stop herself, falling into the darkness below. When Elena opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the desolate landscape. She was back in the cafe, sitting at the same table, her hand clutching her coffee cup. The warmth of the mug felt too familiar, too normal. Her heart raced, her chest tightening as she looked around, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The world outside the cafe was quiet. Too quiet. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? She turned her head slowly and froze. Liam was sitting across from her, his dark eyes watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He hadn't moved since the moment she had fallen, and yet he was here. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this can't be happening." Liam's lips curled into a faint, sad smile. "It's happening, and you're the reason it's all happening, Elena." Her heart stopped. What do you mean?" He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a knowledge she couldn't quite grasp. "You were always meant to open the cracks. You were never meant to be just a bystander in all of this. You were the catalyst, the key that binds everything together. The real question is..." He paused, his gaze sharpening. "What will you do now?" Elena felt her pulse quicken. Her mind raced, but no answers came. Only a growing realization that nothing, was as it seemed. And the true story was only just beginning. Final chap, the choice. The cafe felt suffocating now, its quiet atmosphere pressing in on Elena like a thick fog. She stared at Liam, the reality of what he had said crashing down on her. The key, the catalyst. Her hands trembled as she reached for her coffee cup, the liquid inside now cold and untouched. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't even understand. What's happening to me?" Liam's gaze softened, but there was no pity in it. "It's not about what's happening to you, Elena. It's about what you're becoming." She blinked, confusion clouding her mind. "Becoming? You're not just a person, not just someone caught up in this. You're something more. You always have been. The cracks, the rifts, they're part of you. The moment you stepped into this world, you began to shape it. And when you crossed into the limbo, when you touched the other side..." He hesitated, his words heavy with meaning. "You crossed a line. There's no going back." Elena stood up abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. "No, this doesn't make any sense. I can't. This isn't real." Liam didn't move, his calmness unnerving. "You think I want this to be real? Do you think I would drag you into this if I had any choice?" She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I don't understand. If the cracks are a part of me, if I can control them, why did you have to use me? Why couldn't you just fix it yourself?" He stood slowly, the weight of her words clearly sinking in. "I couldn't do it alone. The cracks aren't just paths to other worlds. They're fragile. They're tied to the very fabric of reality, and when they break, when they fracture, only someone like you can repair them. But that comes at a cost." Elena's chest tightened. "A cost?" He nodded. "You'll have to choose. If you want to fix everything, to stop the cracks from spreading, you'll have to stay connected to them. Your essence, your soul, it's tied to the fractures now. You'll never be able to leave them, but if you want to break free, to go back to a normal life..." He swallowed, the words painful to say. "It'll mean everything. The cracks, the worlds, the balance will collapse. It will destroy everything." A chill ran down Elena's spine. "You're asking me to choose between saving this world and saving myself?" Liam's face darkened, the regret clear in his eyes. "I never wanted to put you in this position, but this isn't just about us anymore. It's about everything." She felt the weight of his words settle on her chest like a stone. Her mind whirled, torn between the impossible choices before her. Could she live with the knowledge that by stepping away, she would destroy everything? That everything she knew, every person she cared about, would be swallowed up in the rift? And yet, how could she bear to stay in this world of fractured realities, never fully herself, always tethered to something she didn't understand? "I don't want this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never asked for any of this. I just wanted to live, to have a life." Liam took a step closer, his expression softening with understanding. "I know. I'm sorry." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision press down on her. She thought of everything she had lost, everything she had ever wanted, and realized with a sinking feeling that she had always known, deep down, that her life wasn't meant to be ordinary, that something was always pulling her, calling her to something greater, something beyond this world. But was that something worth the cost? The hum of the world around her seemed to grow louder, the cracks in reality beginning to pulse again, just beneath the surface. She could feel them, feel the pull of the void, calling her. She could fix it. She could save everything. But at what cost? Liam was watching her, his face filled with uncertainty. "Elena, I can't make this decision for you. You have to decide what kind of person you want to be, what kind of world you want to live in. Her heart was torn in two. The cracks, the power, the mystery, the potential, it was all so tempting. But she wasn't just a vessel for otherworldly forces. She was Alina. She wanted to live, to love, to find a place where she truly belonged. Not as some keeper of worlds, but as herself. Her mind cleared, and with it came a single, unshakable thought. She had to choose herself. "I choose," she began, her voice stronger now, the decision forming in her heart. "I choose to let go. I choose to live my own life." Liam's face fell as if her words had pierced him, but he didn't argue. He didn't stop her. "Are you sure? Once you close the cracks, you can't go back." "I'm sure," she said, her voice firm. "It's time to move on, to find my own way, and I'm not going to destroy everything just to fix something that was never mine to control." Liam nodded slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Then I'll help you. I'll help you close them." The hum grew louder, and Elena felt the energy of the cracks surge around them, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. "Are you ready?" Liam asked. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, letting the calm wash over her. She took one last look at the world around her, the cafe, the ordinary life she had almost forgotten, and then made her decision. She held out her hand to Liam. "Let's end it. Together." And with that, the world began to shift once more. The cracks sealed themselves one by one, the humming slowly fading until there was nothing but silence. Elena felt the weight lift from her shoulders, the pull of the rift gone. The air around them cleared, and when she opened her eyes again, everything felt still, normal. The world was whole again. Liam stood beside her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment they didn't speak. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You did it. You saved everything." Elena looked up at him, a strange peace settling over her. "No, we did it." She turned, her heart light for the first time in what felt like forever. "And now," she said, "I can finally live my own story." Liam smiled softly, stepping away. "You always could." And with that he vanished into the fading twilight, leaving Elena standing alone, but no longer lost. For the first time she felt whole,